for development. What linguistics do we need in the developing world and why? So we know Dr. Ahmar Mahboob is a teacher from the University of Sydney, and he is also an organizer and co-creator of this free linguistics conference. But thanks to his efforts and hard work, we are able to gather here today. Okay. And a little more introduction to Dr. Mahboob. Ahmar has worked in the areas of language policy development, Pidgin and Creole languages, NS studies, English language acquisition, English language teaching and teacher education, world Englishes, pragmatics, and issues surrounding minority languages in South Asia. Okay. Ahmar has published over 50 articles and papers, and he's also the editor of TESOL Quarterly. And he was also the associate editor of Linguistics and the Human Sciences, and serves on the editorial boards of a number of journals. Okay, so now, Dr. Ahmar Mahboob.
Thank you. So let me start off by telling you a bit about why I'm giving this talk today. It's quite different from the kind of talks I'm used to giving, which are based on analysis of language in particular context or development of language in contexts. Today I'll be talking about linguistics for development. And I'll be talking about why is it that I want to talk about it, and where did I come up with this notion of trying to build this into an argument and presenting it at a conference like this, but also at other places. Now, my first degree in linguistics was from the Department of English at the University of Karachi in Pakistan. As part of my degree in linguistics, we took courses on syntax, phonology, phonetics, morphology, but essentially most of our units of the study were focused on English language teaching. We were, after all, in a Department of English, and the assumption was that after we finished our degrees with a Masters in Linguistics from the Department of English at the University of Karachi, we will be going into the field as language teachers. Now, this is not a unique experience. For many of us, especially people who are from a non-English speaking country, our experiences in Department of Linguistics are very similar, or even departments of applied linguistics, that we are essentially being trained as language teachers. In fact, we are being trained as English language teachers. Now, after I finished my Masters at Karachi University, I moved to the US, and I did my first Masters again in linguistics, in applied linguistics actually this time, at Indiana University in Bloomington. And as part of my training at Indiana University, essentially all the units I was taking were units on language teaching methodology, language testing, and then again units on like courses on, say, grammar, generative grammar, transformational grammar, optimality theory. And at that point I started wondering, why is it that, let's forget about everything else, let's say even as somebody who's being trained as a language teacher, why is it that I need a course on transformation grammar? How will I use that in a classroom? How will I use my understanding of being able to transform a surface deep structure to a surface structure help me as a classroom teacher? And again, we're not talking about any other application of linguistics. Also, within my own cohort, when I was working on my PhD, everybody in my department, now at this point I'm in the Department of Linguistics at Indiana University. My PhD focuses on applied linguistics, but my colleagues were doing all kinds of linguistics. But essentially, everybody in the applied linguistics was looking at one or the other aspect of language teaching. Looking at pedagogical aspects, looking at teaching, looking at language acquisition, but that was about it. So for people who graduated from a department like mine at Karachi University, or graduated from a department of linguistics or applied linguistics at Indiana University at around the time I was there, left that program thinking that applied linguistics is about language teaching. You get a degree in applied linguistics and you go out and you become a language teacher. Similarly, actually not similarly, if you look actually at job market, if you look at advertisements for English language teachers, you will find that most of them require a qualification either in TESOL or applied linguistics. What this means implies that there's a general understanding that applied linguistics is for language teaching. This is a very common perception. I've had conversations with people at the conference. I've been having conversations with people in many different parts of the world. And essentially every time I come up with the same explanation that our students who graduate with a degree in linguistics or applied linguistics are doing that to become language teachers. Now, that's, I think, is a disservice, because linguistics and applied linguistics is much broader than language or applications of linguistics in education. We heard this morning, we heard Dr. Wang's session this morning, who was looking at legal discourse, and that will be something I'll talk about as well briefly. But there are lots of other applications. And it is in those directions that I think that we really need to look at if we want to use linguistics for development, and use linguistics for development, not just in the developing world, but also in the developed world. For example, as I was saying, I was talking about Indiana University, which is in the US. What I'm building on is not something totally new. If you look at Edward Sapir, going back to the 1920s, he wrote, it is peculiarly important that linguists, who are often accused, and accused justly, of failure to look beyond the pretty patterns of their subject matter, should become aware of what their science may mean for the interpretation of human conduct in general. So this understanding that linguistics can offer things beyond what we do within our field as linguists or applied linguists needs to be looked at. In a similar vein, but much later, a journal writes in the journal Language and Society that adoption of linguistics at institutions of higher learning in its present international disciplinary form and in its expression through the medium of English, because English is a major foreign or second language in much of the world and by far the dominant language for the discipline of linguistics, can be contrary to the public good in less developed countries. This is of course my highlighting, but it's very important to stress this. Can be contrary to the public good in less developed countries and emerging speech communities. Linguistics in its current international disciplinary form serves needs different from those of emerging speech communities, where a new language treatment system ought to be created by a new cadre of caretakers of the community's language resources. Now throughout the talk I will be unpacking quite a bit of this, but it's just to start off, I mean, why is it that it's contrary to the public good in less developed countries? Part of the reason of this is because it's usually equated with English language teaching. And if that's the only aspect of linguistics that you're looking at in the less developed countries of how linguistics can be used, then you are actually not providing the benefits of doing linguistics to the society that you're working in. So that's something that we need to contend. We need to contend that that language studies can offer much more to us than commentary on literature and ways of teaching a language. In the words of Brumfitt, language specialists should be interested in responding to real-world problems in which language is a central issue. Now again, throughout my talks and experiences in many parts of the world, one of the questions I often ask, like an audience like this, I won't ask you guys today, but I often ask and I often start with, is I ask people to write down, take a minute and write down on a piece of paper what they mean by language. And I turn this into a bit of a magician sort of a game, and I say, let me be a magician. And I tell them that I can predict that 95% of the audience would have written something like, language is communication. Language is communicating with each other. Right? This is a general sort of a sense of what people believe language to be. And this is, again, not a general audience. This is an audience of people who have degrees or qualifications in linguistics and applied linguistics. I further asked them, what is grammar? And I think Jim was talking about grammar. People think of it, this notion of just an assembly of words. But if you ask people what grammar is, again, an audience like this, very often people will say, grammar is a set of rules that you use in language. And that's essentially their interpretation of what grammar is. So people who are doing linguistics or doing applied linguistics who are language teachers have a very sort of a narrow understanding of what language is and what grammar is. And because these understandings essentially come from a perspective of language teaching, perhaps you can forgive them, because as language teachers, they are training their students to become better communicators, whatever that might mean. They're using grammar so that their students can use the rules of grammar to be able to write write in the way that they're expected to. So that becomes the focus of how they see grammar and how they see language. But of course, as people in this room would know, language is not just about communication. It's much more than communication. Grammar is not about a set of rules that you obey, but grammar is perhaps a theory of language, where the theory is an explanation of the phenomenon, and the phenomenon is the set of data or the observations of data of language that you collect. It's your ability to hypothesize and abstract an understanding of the use of language in terms of what becomes a theory of language, or what we call a grammar. And language itself is, in terms of Halliday, for example, would, as we use in this context, is a semogenic system, a system that creates meaning. It is not, of course, we use it to communicate, we use it to interact with others, but it is not equivalent to communication. Now, once we start changing our perspective on language, and we start changing our understanding of grammar, that sort of opens up how we can start applying understandings of language and linguistics in different contexts, and how we can make it useful for the societies that we live in. I guess part of the purpose of the Martin Center is, I was looking at its description, is the notion of appliable linguistics. And this is, of course, built on Michael Halliday's work, the notion that appliable linguistics is an approach to language that takes everyday, real-life language-related problems, both theoretical and practical, in diverse social, professional, and academic contexts as a starting point, and it develops and contributes to a theoretical model of language that can respond to and is applicable into context. The key idea here, I guess, I would say, is the application of understandings of language to be able to resolve and address real-world problems. To date, most of the work that we tend to do, especially in the developing economies, tend to focus on language teaching. But there's much more that we can do. And so part of the reason that I chose to give this talk is to sort of extend that and try to work with professionals, with people who are PhD supervisors, as well as people who are looking for topics to do their PhDs on, to consider topics that don't necessarily just link us to education, but look at broader applications of linguistics. So what are some of the areas that we can work in? We can work in areas like business, we can look at healthcare, we can look at law, we can look at politics and social issues. And again, this is just a tip of the iceberg. There's lots more that linguistics can apply to. And in doing this, we are creating a relevance of linguistics to everyday life. We are creating a relevance of what linguistics is and what linguists can do to help the communities that we live in, whatever those communities might be. In the context of business, there have been very interesting papers. There's a paper by Yulia who even goes as far as talking about a subdiscipline called business linguistics, and looking at how business linguistics might have a whole set of areas that we might want to explore. Things like business discourse, looking at professional sub-languages, looking at language of PR, looking at business rhetoric, looking at documentation of correspondence, drafting contracts, looking at instructional context of teaching business and management, looking at business lexicography, looking at language of business media, and also looking at intercultural business communication. This is a whole lot of different sets of issues and questions that can be asked and addressed with some understanding of language. This takes us to some very interesting examples of the studies of how people try to do these studies, and how do they apply to it. I'll start off with a story. A couple of months ago, I was at the airport in Hong Kong, at the Hong Kong airport, and I was a bit hungry, and I wanted to eat something, but I was also at that point very health conscious, and I wanted to be careful about what I ate. So what I did was I went to a juice bar, and I asked for I got I think a cup of carrot juice, very healthy, but that wasn't satisfying enough, and I wanted something. I had craving for chips. And as I looked at the counter, there was this whole pack of beautifully packed chips, right? And these chips were really nice packaged, beautiful writing, and it's like, no fat, baked, not fried, low sodium. It had all the right keywords for me because I was a health freak at that time. I'm no longer that conscious, but at that point in time, I was quite a bit of a health freak, and I wanted something that is really healthy. So I picked up this packet of chips, which was 24 Hong Kong dollars. Not cheap. Like, you can probably pick up a packet of crisps at 7-Eleven for 7-8 Hong Kong dollars. But this nicely, very well packaged packet of chips is something I got. I opened it, and there were exactly 10 chips. 10 chips in this huge packet. The rest of it was just air. So after eating my unsatisfying 10 chips, I had a lot of time still, so I read the package in the back. It actually said that it had 10 chips. It was all about how good these chips are, and how even though you're having just 10 chips, how good it is for you, and how it's worth the money that you paid for it. So there's of course a lot of language and packaging of language and other semiotic resources, the imaging, the colors, the texture of the packaging, that all appealed to a person like me at that point in time. But this is in a sense where you can use our understandings of language and look at, it's like yesterday Wendy Boucher was talking about multimodal discourse analysis, looking at how these multimodal texts, this artifact, this package of chips, attracts people like me to pay 4 times as much money as I would have for only 10 chips. But that's in a sense is looking at how language is used for advertisement, it's used for marketing, and as linguists we can perhaps study how this material is packaged, how these artifacts are created to appeal to people like us. And there are actually people who are linguists who are kind of looking at these kind of things. So this is an example study by Cook looking at sweet talking, food, language and democracy, and looking at how linguistic choices on packaging or other advertisement material contribute to the economy, and how we as linguists and applied linguists can study these linguistic artifacts, to analyze these artifacts to see how we pay 4 times as much money to buy 10 chips. So there's a real world application, there's a real world implication of doing this kind of research in this context. One area that I'm fascinated by, and I've been collecting quite a bit of data, which I haven't analyzed it, but hopefully will at some point, is looking at the applications of language sciences in the context of healthcare. As I said, I originally am from Pakistan, and I do go back and spend quite a bit of time there. And one of the things that I've been looking at and collecting data on is patient-doctor interactions across different social classes. So if you were to go to a private doctor at a sort of if you're coming from a middle-class context and you go to an expensive and a well-recognized and well-reputed doctor and you're paying prime money for it, you will spend about 30 minutes on an average with the doctor. The doctor is going to spend, take your history, they will talk to you about your symptoms, they will talk to you about your lifestyle, they will educate you, they will give you they will of course give you a prescription, but they will also tell you what to do in terms of trying not to spread the disease in your household. They will educate the patient, they will educate them about what the disease is and how it spreads and how it can be controlled. There's a lot of discourse there, and a lot of it is bilingual. But if you go down the road and you go to a neighborhood which is not as well off, then essentially what you have is a doctor who's sitting on a desk with a line of patients which revolves around his desk. There's a line of chairs which goes around his desk and then goes out into the lobby, into the waiting area. And the way it operates is that if it's your turn, you come to the chair which is next to the doctor. The doctor will ask you a few questions about your symptoms. He will write you, he or she will write you a prescription, and you will leave. After you've left, you get your prescription, and that's it. The whole transaction, I'm calling it a transaction, takes less than 2 minutes on average. So notice the difference between a 2-minute transaction between a doctor and a patient, and a 30-minute discussion about an issue in a middle-class context. So of course, the kind of healthcare that you're getting is tremendously different across these two contexts. Now, one of the questions I asked these doctors is, what is it that during their medical training were they actually trained on how to interact with these patients? The answer universally that I have received so far is no. So none of these doctors, medically trained doctors, are ever trained how to actually interact with patients in their clinics. Now, why don't they do it? It's partly, again, I think this is where the linguists come up, and it's partly the responsibility of the linguists to provide the descriptions of appropriate doctor-patient interactions in a multilingual, in a bilingual context that can be used by the medical schools to train the doctors. So that the doctors are aware of how to interact with these patients, how not to just take a brief history and then give them a prescription, but how they can use that time, this extremely precious time between the doctor and the patient, to educate the patient a bit, which will serve a larger community. So what you're doing then is actually not just treating a particular patient, but you're actually educating the patient so that the particular illness that is being talked about can be managed and can be controlled within the society and the community. This is not happening. So when you look at the developing world, again I'll talk about Pakistan here, you have huge epidemics of diseases that have largely been controlled in many other parts of the world. And the doctor-patient interactions is a very crucial place where, especially in a society where literacy is very low, which can serve as a pivotal point in which you can reduce the kind of problems that happen. But those meetings are being wasted essentially. And I think it's not only the doctor's fault that's happening, but it's a linguist's responsibility to provide these explanations and discourses that can be used in the medical schools, and that is not being done. Why is it not being done? It's not being done because the Department of Linguists are only looking at English language teaching. So if you equate linguistics to English language teaching, then you're leaving out all these extremely important aspects of language and use of language in our communities that stay unexplored and unstudied, and therefore have a huge impact on the lives of people in our communities. Over lunch, I was talking to one of the participants at the conference, and I was talking about how you can look at this similarly in the context of the information that you get with medicine. Right? When you buy medical packages, I'm not sure again about China, but when I buy a medicine in Pakistan, and these are multinational pharmaceutical companies, I always get a flyer, a little leaflet. Do you get them here in China? Little leaflets about information about the medicine. Okay. Now, I don't know what happens in China, but I'll tell you in Pakistan, they're usually bilingual, English and Urdu. But one, they are so minute in text height. I mean, you would really need a microscope to read them. The font size is probably 6. I mean, so one, you can't even read them. Two, if you do invest time to read them, like I do because I'm interested in this, you will find that even though I have some literacy in Urdu and I've got some literacy in English, I don't understand this text. That text, as perhaps in terms of Jim's work, was very abstract. They were using technical terms. They were using a technical language which perhaps works for the pharmacists, but if the pharmacist is trying to communicate with a lay audience, with limited literacy, then that text just does not translate. I will not be able to understand it. And if I'm not able to understand, I'm going to assume that a lot of other Pakistanis reading these texts will also not be able to understand them. So what is the usual response to these texts? People don't read them. They don't even bother. Okay. I don't know again if that's the experience here, but how many of you read those little text leaflets that you get? A few of you? Good. But not everybody does. Again, because it's the kind of language that you include and the kind of text that there is just not there. Okay, you guys are very good, right? Okay, exceptions. But in general, people don't do that. Why? Because that language is just not appropriate. Even if they invested the time, they will not be able to understand what this text means. Which means, again, it's a waste of resources, a waste of paper, because nobody's using it. Where do the linguists come in? The linguists can come in terms of understanding how language works for pharmacists, but then how do you translate that language? How do you decrease the semantic density of the text to a degree where a lay audience, an uneducated, non-specialized audience will be able to read this information, perhaps using multimodal text, to be able to actually make them user-friendly. Using images and a bit of text doesn't have to be a lot of text, but a clear message simply presented will go a lot further than these extremely complex texts that are being produced now. Again, these are things that linguists can help with if we invest the time in studying them. And again, from a development economy sort of a perspective, from a Pakistani perspective, I know that our linguists are not doing it. Why? Because they are investing all their time looking at teaching of English. And if that's the only thing they're doing, then again, linguistics is not being utilized as an important discipline that can contribute to the development of the country. Again, there's some really, really interesting sort of examples out there. This is going to be my last example, and then we'll move into other things. But this is a study of applying systemic functional linguistics to conversations with people who have dementia. Again, I'm giving you an example from Pakistan. In Pakistan, when people have dementia, we use a word in common Urdu. It's that a person has gone crazy. I mean, that's a rough equivalent. So these people who get dementia, who have Alzheimer's, who have other diseases which come with an advanced age, we just think that these people have gone crazy. And that's the common word that we use. So essentially, the way that people see these people with problems is crazy people. Old people are crazy because they can't talk anymore. They can't interact with you anymore. But essentially, these people who have particular illnesses or diseases are using language in a different way because of a particular illness. There's a particular way in which they use language. And linguists have been studying that. They have been studying how people with particular kind of illnesses use language differently from a normal, average human being. And also how you use those understandings to be able to better communicate with these people, to be able to use that understanding of language, to be able to communicate with people with particular kinds of illnesses. Again, that's a huge gap that we don't have in many other parts of the world. And again, patients are, doctors don't know how to deal with them. The nurses are not very trained in how to deal with them. And the family members are not trained how to deal with them. And so the treatment of these people with these diseases and illnesses is quite poor. And that can be changed by educating people and through an understanding of how language works in these cases. Again, something that linguists can contribute to, but are perhaps not contributing to in the way that we want them to. So I'm quite cognizant of time right now, and so I won't give you a lot more examples, but as you know, Dr. Wang talked about court proceedings. That's again one way of looking at court proceedings. But again, one of the questions I think, one of the questions that the audience member asked this morning was, you're translating the Chinese proceedings into English and then analyzing the text in English. And what implications does that have for analysis? And that's a very good question to ask. If linguists are not actually, let's say Dr. Wang's analysis was using Jim and Peter White's appraisal analysis, which was developed looking at English as the data source for the analysis or for theory building. So what Dr. Wang did was translate the Chinese text into English and then analyze the English text. Now the question, of course, is as the participant asked, what is lost during the translation process? Of course, what also applies is that if you have a particular system or a theoretical framework that is developed based on a particular set of data, which in this case is English, then how does that analytical framework gets adapted to Chinese? How do we need to adapt it? And perhaps the answer is yes. We perhaps need to adapt that system and the theoretical lens to the context of Chinese, and then look at the Chinese texts so that we know what's actually happening in the Chinese text rather than simply translating and using the English model of analysis for the text. So again, what we see here is a huge influence of English-based linguistics on other parts of the world in another context. And these are again questions that we need to ask and we need to consider in developing linguistics as a field of study that contributes to the development of a country and the people. We can have lots of similar examples from different political and social issues as well, but I will leave them for another time. I instead want to talk briefly about a resolution that we wrote in Lahore a couple of years ago, in January of 2013. Free Linguistics Conference in association with a university in Pakistan organized the first international conference on language sciences in the developing world. And as part of what we did for this conference was all the keynote and plenary and focus speakers as well as other key participants workshop for 2 days to draft what we call Lahore Declaration on Language Sciences in the Developing World. And let me share this with you. I won't go through the whole text. You can download this. What's happening here? Sorry. I believe it with the reference at point. Okay. Lahore elaboration on language sciences in the developing world. I won't go through the whole text, but one of the things that we did was we set out a list of suggestions that we consider are extremely important for using linguistics in context of developing world and what needs to be done. One of them is set up independent department of applied or linguistics, not embedded in English or other language programs. It's quite important to keep them distinct because we don't want to get trapped into the linguistics literature debate or end up becoming instruments for looking at education only. Develop research on local languages. A lot of Department of Linguistics don't actually do that in many parts of the world. They focus essentially on English or another colonial language. Develop research that is designed to address real-world problems, both identifying the issues and acting upon them. So the purpose is not simply to document the problem, but actually to look at ways of addressing them as well. Develop informed theoretical and methodological approaches. Develop research that includes but is not limited to language education. Develop collaborative interdisciplinary research. And again, Jim's talk today was exemplifying how you can have this very useful discourses between, for example, sociology and linguistics, but this can be across any discipline. If you want to look at the medical examples, then again, medical professionals, medical schools, and linguists could be very useful. Develop regional and international collaborative research projects and frames of reference. By frames of reference, we mean that you need a frame of reference that is adapted to your context in which you're working, not simply adopting one that has been published in the West or in English or through English, but looking more at the local context. Develop policies and pedagogies that are multilingually oriented. Jim's example today was, of course, looking at Australian context. In Australia, the idea is that you have a monolingual, even though it's not a monolingual, the purpose of education is to focus on English and through English, because English is seen as the dominant language of the country. But in other parts of the world, that's not the case. And when we talk about, for example, the shift in the semantic wave, we need to think not just how to unpack technical terms through everyday language, but actually perhaps even multilingually. And how does that work out, and how do we develop that? Again, looking at it in terms of local context and multilingual perspectives. Develop resources on and in local languages, and developing the capacities of legal professionals to implement project goals. And establish linguistic networks and associations. This, again, does not always happen. I know China does have this, but in many other parts of the world, that is not something that we have. This text was, of course, developed by a number of different people, and it's also been endorsed by TESOL International Research Forum and the TESOL International as well. Now, sort of briefly, to end the talk, I want to sort of say, how do we actually do this? So if you're a PhD student or if you're developing a research project, how do you actually go about doing this kind of work? And how do you go about training your students to do this kind of work? Let me go back here. So one way of doing it, and I'd love to talk more about it during coffee break or during dinner tonight, is what I call the credible sort of an approach to research. Credible is an acronym, and it stands for this. What is credible research? Credible research has to be contextually relevant. It has to respond to theoretical and practical needs. It needs to engage the stakeholders. It needs to draw on an understanding of local knowledge and practices. It should be informed by global approaches and experience. So it's not just local; it's also globally informed. It has to benefit the local communities, and I think this is extremely important. When I teach my master's students and they have to go out and do their research projects, one of the things I try to drill into them is that your research project is not just collecting data from a lay audience, but you have to consider how you're actually going to benefit that community. So it's not just carrying out interviews or collecting survey data, but think about how are you going to use your work to help this community and support them. And I believe that if you do this first 6 things, then the L comes automatically. You are, in a sense, because you're contextually relevant, you're looking at theoretical, you're engaging people, then you in a sense become a leader within the field and discipline, and you're contributing to the larger global theories by being so specific and focused on action. And of course, this all needs to be ethical. So ethics in research are extremely important. So this is what I mean by credible research. And this credible research, I think, gives us a way of trying to understand how appliable linguistics can be turned into a methodology. And if we had time, I would break this up further, and I would actually perhaps talk to you about how to go about creating a research project that has a credible orientation and appliable orientation. But that's perhaps for another time. Today we'll just conclude by saying that what we need is to think of linguistics beyond just language education or English language education in many parts of the world. What we need is collaborative research with other disciplines, with people who are also dealing with other real-life issues, and to develop projects that are credible and appropriate, using models of language that are appropriate to that context. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for an interesting and constructive talk. We have 2 minutes, so we have time for one question maybe. If someone has a microphone?
I'm now. Oh, okay. In terms of, from a development perspective, and I'm familiar with China, I'm not familiar with Pakistan, but from a linguistic perspective, I'm thinking about something like those little packets, the little leaflets in the packets. Now, you were discussing in terms of how they can better communicate, but it's a question of, are they actually designed to communicate, or are they designed to satisfy a requirement that someone else has put on them? And in a Chinese perspective, I see a lot of use of language that's neither to communicate nor to create meaning, but instead merely to exist. And to exempt from English language t-shirts that mean nothing, to pinyin under signs, to presentations that don't convey anything, to websites that have long lists of information that nobody ever cares about. So, what I'm saying is, from a linguistics perspective, the linguistics profession can create the advice and the paradigm, but what about from the other perspective about creating the desire to communicate and incentivizing communication or generating meaning?
And that would be the goal, right? So I would say that taking a radical sort of an orientation, your research projects would not just be analyzing the language of these texts, but would actually be creating ways of giving examples of how this could be done differently, and then interfacing with the stakeholders to actually use that knowledge to try to implement it in particular context, so that you're actually redesigning some of this material. Again, I can't speak about China here, but I can talk about Pakistan, that you can actually redesign this. And I've got students who've done some very interesting work after the 2010 floods, the huge flooding in Pakistan in the province of Sindh, on how they worked and using their understanding of semiotics and multimodal text, on how they designed leaflets for prevention of communicable diseases for people who have very low literacy in rural Sindh. And again, that's where you can actually utilize it. And so that's what the idea of credible motion is, that you're engaging with the stakeholders and you're trying to actually address these problems. So it's not just doing the theoretical analysis, but using the analysis and applying it in context. And that's again the notion of appliable, that your notion is appliable is addressing real world concerns through analysis, through theory, but having an application and making sure that application actually happens.
Okay, sorry, we don't have time for more questions. If you want to ask anything, just come up and say hi. We need a coffee break or dinner. So we have a little gift for you as well.
Thank you.